gain what he had. His former bodyguard, Gene Deal, said he seen him doing a ritual where they dove. What is that? And I feel like it's being overlooked because they see him doing the dance moves with the baggy clothes. You know, some of the ladies in his videos were trans ladies. You got to really look at what's going on.
They say in Hollywood, silence is never random. It's strategic. But what happens when that silence starts sounding louder than the accusations themselves? Because right now, Snoop Dogg, the man the world calls America's unbothered uncle, the face of peace, music, and mainstream success, is suddenly being pulled into a storm he has spent decades carefully dancing around. And according to explosive claims circulating from alleged insiders, this isn't just industry gossip anymore. It's something much heavier. We're talking about private conversations that were never meant to leave closed doors. Conversations allegedly involving Diddy, disturbing party culture rumors and claims of things seen, things heard, and things never spoken about publicly. Not in court, not in interviews, not in any official record. Until now, where whispers are turning into full-blown digital firestorms. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. Because the version of events being pushed online doesn't paint Snoop as a bystander. It paints him as someone who allegedly knew more than he ever admitted publicly. Someone who reportedly had rules for avoiding certain situations, early exits from certain events, and warnings passed through inner circles like survival instructions in an industry nobody fully controls. But if that's true, then the real question isn't what he knew. It's why none of it was ever said out loud when it mattered most. Now add federal cases, sealed documents, lawsuits involving dozens of accusers, and documentaries digging deeper than ever before. And suddenly, this isn't just about one artist or one friendship. It becomes about what people in power see and what they choose to ignore. And the most dangerous part? According to these claims, the silence wasn't accidental. It was learned, it was practiced, and it may not hold up much longer. Because once the system starts speaking through court files, witnesses, and leaked testimonies, even the biggest names in the industry lose control of the narrative. So the question now isn't what happened behind closed doors. The question is, who's still protecting the truth, and who's about to get exposed by it? So once you get past the hook, this is where the story starts to shift from internet noise into something people are actually paying attention to. Because according to the claims circulating online, this isn't just about rumors floating around hip-hop culture. It's about a pattern of silence, distance, and very intentional avoidance that allegedly stretches back years, maybe even decades. And Snoop Dogg sits right in the middle of that conversation. Now, let's be very clear before we go deeper. None of these claims have been proven in court, and a lot of this comes from alleged insider talk, online leaks, and secondhand accounts. But the reason it's blowing up is because of who it's attached to and what kind of details are being described. Because people are now pointing back at old interviews, old clips, old moments that at the time looked harmless, but now feel completely different when you rewatch them through this lens. And one of the biggest things being discussed is this idea of knowledge without testimony. In simple terms, people are asking, if someone really knew something serious was happening in the industry, why didn't it ever reach court? Why didn't it ever become official? Why did it stay in private conversations inside inner circles and never make it into a legal record? According to these circulating claims, Snoop allegedly spoke to people close to him, bodyguards, associates, and industry friends, about situations involving Diddy that made him uncomfortable enough to change how he moved at events. Again, allegedly. People online are now breaking down old stories where Snoop supposedly had exit routines at certain industry gatherings, showing up, staying visible, but leaving early before the energy of the night shifted. Some even claim there were unspoken signals between his team and security, like a coordinated understanding of when to move out. Now, whether that's true or exaggerated, the internet is treating it like a puzzle piece that suddenly fits into a much bigger picture. Because the moment you connect that with Diddy's ongoing legal troubles, the federal scrutiny, the lawsuits, and the public investigations, the entire narrative starts to feel heavier than just celebrity drama. And that's where things get even more controversial. Because according to these viral breakdowns, Snoop allegedly wasn't just aware of industry rumors. He was supposedly warning people around him to be careful in certain environments. Not publicly, not on record, but privately within trusted circles. And that raises a very uncomfortable question that people keep repeating. If you knew enough to warn people, why stop there? Why not go further? Why not go on record? But that's exactly where the story splits into two completely different interpretations. One side of the internet says this is responsible survival, knowing how dangerous the industry can be and choosing self-preservation over involvement. The other side says it's selective silence, speaking when it's safe, staying quiet when it matters most, and only reacting when the pressure becomes unavoidable. And right now, both sides are clashing online. But here's where the story becomes even more intense. Because this isn't happening in isolation. It's happening at the same time as documentaries, civil lawsuits, and federal cases are building momentum around Diddy's entire network. That means more witnesses are being contacted, more names are being discussed, and more past connections are being re-examined under legal pressure. And once that machine starts moving, it doesn't stop for reputation. It doesn't stop for friendship. And it definitely doesn't stop for silence. So people are now asking if the entertainment industry is finally entering a phase where old, untold stories are no longer safe to keep buried. And that's where Snoop's name keeps resurfacing, not as a defendant, not as a charged figure, but as someone allegedly close enough to have seen things from the inside, yet distant enough to avoid public consequences. And that position is exactly what makes this so controversial. Because in the court of public opinion, proximity creates responsibility, even if the law doesn't say the same thing. But there's another layer here that people aren't talking about enough. The idea of career survival versus truth exposure. Snoop Dogg is not just a rapper in this equation. He is a global brand. Television appearances, commercial deals, family-friendly image campaigns, mainstream endorsements, all built on a carefully maintained public identity. So if even a fraction of these allegations or claims ever moved from internet discussion into formal testimony, the impact wouldn't just be personal, it would be structural. It would affect everything around him. And that is why some people believe silence isn't accidental, it's protective. But critics argue protection always has a cost. Because the longer you stay silent during major industry scandals, the more the internet fills in the gaps for you. And once the internet starts filling gaps, it rarely paints neutral pictures. It paints extremes. Now add another factor, timing. Because this wave of discussion didn't come out of nowhere. It's being fueled by ongoing legal developments, resurfaced interviews, and viral podcast clips where old reactions are being reinterpreted as signs or coded responses. A pause in an interview becomes evidence of discomfort. A joke becomes deflection. A refusal to answer becomes knowledge without disclosure. And whether that interpretation is fair or not, it's spreading fast. So at this point, the narrative isn't controlled by one interview or one statement anymore. It's being built collectively by millions of viewers rewatching old content with new suspicion. And that's what makes it so difficult to stop. Because once public perception shifts, silence no longer protects clarity. It creates speculation. And speculation is where things start to spiral. So now the story is no longer just about what Snoop allegedly said in private. It's about what the public believes he knew. And in today's internet culture, belief spreads faster than proof. Which brings us to the most important question going forward into part 2. If the pressure continues building from lawsuits, documentaries, and leaked testimonies, does silence still remain an option? Or does the story eventually force every name connected to step forward and explain their side, whether they want to or not? Because right now, this isn't just an entertainment headline anymore. It's turning into a countdown. And this is where the situation stops feeling like online speculation and starts feeling like a pressure cooker building toward a breaking point. Because once the narrative moves into lawsuits, subpoenas, and documentary investigations, the conversation is no longer controlled by social media commentary. It shifts into something much more rigid: legal frameworks, sworn testimony, and evidence that can be questioned under oath. And that's exactly why people keep circling back to Snoop Dogg in this entire discussion. Not because he's been charged with anything, not because there is an official case against him, But because of what these circulating claims suggest about proximity, awareness, and long-term silence inside an industry already under intense scrutiny. According to the viral breakdowns, the alleged issue isn't just what was seen, it's what was kept out of official channels. People are pointing toward the idea that conversations were happening behind closed doors, in private environments, with no paper trail, no formal statements, and no legal follow-up. And that creates a very specific type of public suspicion. Because in high-profile investigations, what matters is not only what happened, but what could have been documented and wasn't. Now again, nothing in this narrative has been proven, and a lot of it exists in the gray area of online interpretation. But the internet doesn't wait for confirmation anymore. It builds theories in real time and fills silence with meaning. And Snoop's silence, whether intentional, strategic, or simply personal, has become part of the story itself. People are now revisiting old clips where he appears cautious when certain names come up in interviews. Moments where he changes tone, shifts subjects, or avoids expanding on industry stories. At the time, those moments didn't raise eyebrows. But in today's climate, every hesitation is being replayed and reanalyzed like hidden evidence. And that's the problem with fame at this level. Every reaction becomes permanent. Every pause becomes interpretable. Every silence becomes a question mark. Now add another layer, the legal reality surrounding Diddy's case and the broader wave of civil litigation and federal attention tied to the entertainment industry. As more lawsuits are filed and more witnesses come forward, the ecosystem around these allegations expands. And when that happens, people connected to the industry, even indirectly, begin to get pulled into conversations they never publicly signed up for. That's how subpoenas work. That's how discovery works. That's how sealed narratives eventually become unsealed pressure points. So now the internet is asking a very uncomfortable question. If more people are forced to testify under oath, how many private conversations will suddenly become public record? And that question is where things get tense. Because according to the online claims being circulated, some individuals in the industry may have known more than they ever officially reported. Not as participants, but as observers, insiders, or people who simply chose not to involve themselves in legal processes. And that distinction is important, because the law separates knowledge from complicity, but public opinion often does not. In the court of public perception, knowing something and not speaking on it can be viewed as participation in silence. And that's where reputations start to shift. Now, in Snoop's case specifically, his public identity makes this even more complicated. He is not just an artist. He is a cultural figure, a brand, a media personality who has spent years building a universally safe and humorous public image. So when his name gets pulled into conversations like this, the reaction is amplified. People don't just see a rapper being discussed. They see a symbol being questioned. And that symbol is built on trust, familiarity, and perceived transparency. Which means even unverified claims hit harder than they normally would. But there's another angle people are debating online: motive. Why would these claims surface now? Why are old conversations being revisited at this moment in time? Some argue it's timing, connected to ongoing legal developments and increased scrutiny across the industry. Others believe it's content-driven amplification, where creators repackage old rumors into viral narratives because attention cycles are faster than ever. And a smaller group believes it's something more intentional, that as legal pressure increases on major industry figures, previously silent individuals may begin to soft leak information to distance themselves from future liability. None of these theories are confirmed, but all of them are circulating at the same time. And that creates a layered environment where truth and speculation blend together until they're almost indistinguishable for the average viewer. Meanwhile, Snoop continues to operate publicly in his usual role, appearing in media, maintaining brand collaborations, and continuing his mainstream visibility. And that contrast is exactly what fuels the online debate. Because people are comparing two realities: the public-facing entertainer versus the alleged private conversations being described by anonymous sources. And when those two versions don't match perfectly, the gap becomes the story. Now here's where things become even more sensitive. If any part of these circulating claims ever enters a legal setting, whether through subpoenas, witness testimony, or document review, then the entire tone of the conversation changes instantly. Because what is currently being discussed as commentary and speculation would become formal statements recorded under oath, with legal consequences for accuracy. And that is something completely different from social media discourse. That is where reputations are not just discussed, they are tested. So the real tension in this entire situation isn't just about what was allegedly said in private. It's about what could eventually be forced into the open, and whether the people connected to these stories are prepared for that level of exposure. Because once legal systems start connecting dots, silence stops being a shield and starts becoming a risk factor. And that's why people are paying attention now more than ever. Not because there is a confirmed case against Snoop Dogg, but because the environment around him, legally, publicly, and culturally, is changing fast. And in situations like this, change doesn't ask for permission. It just moves forward, which leads directly into the final question everyone is now quietly asking. When the documents surface, when the subpoenas land, and when the conversations finally move from rumor to record, who will still be in control of their own story, and who will no longer have a choice in how it gets told? At this point in the story, the silence isn't just silence anymore, it's pressure. Because when a narrative reaches the level of federal scrutiny, lawsuits stacking up, documentaries circling, and online communities digging through every old interview, the situation stops being about what people think happened and starts becoming about what can be proven, challenged, or officially denied under oath. And that's where everything shifts again in the Snoop Dogg discussion. Because according to the claims being pushed across social media, the issue is no longer just about alleged knowledge of industry rumors. It's about what happens when informal conversations, private warnings, and off-record comments potentially collide with formal legal discovery. And that collision is where reputations either survive or collapse under documentation. Now, let's slow this down and be very clear about what's actually being discussed online versus what is legally established. There is no verified court ruling stating Snoop Dogg was involved in any criminal activity related to Diddy's federal cases or civil lawsuits. What exists right now are allegations, interpretations, resurfaced clips, and anonymous claims being amplified through viral content. But even without formal charges, the perception ecosystem is already active, and that ecosystem does not wait for confirmation. It builds narratives in real time. And in this case, the narrative is built around three repeating ideas. First, that certain people inside the industry allegedly knew more than they ever publicly admitted. Second, that silence in high-profile environments is often strategic, not accidental. And third, that when major legal pressure arrives, those silences may eventually be tested. That combination is what makes this story spread so aggressively, because it is not just about one person. It is about the entire structure of entertainment power, loyalty, and self-preservation. Now, within that structure, Snoop Dogg becomes a symbolic figure in the conversation, not because he is accused of wrongdoing, but because of how often his name appears in discussions about who saw what and when. And that is where public interpretation starts to take over. People begin connecting unrelated moments. Old interviews are replayed. Body language is analyzed. Pauses are reinterpreted. Even jokes from years ago are reframed as hidden signals. And once that happens, the original context starts to disappear. It gets replaced by narrative reconstruction. But here's the uncomfortable truth about that process. Narrative reconstruction is not evidence. It is perception. And perception spreads faster than facts. Now, according to the viral breakdowns fueling this discussion, there is a belief that people in the industry often operate with an unspoken rule. You do not bring unnecessary attention to things that could disrupt your career, your relationships, or your access. And that rule, whether real or exaggerated, is what people believe explains decades of silence across multiple high-profile figures whenever controversial industry topics surface. But critics argue that silence becomes complicity in public perception, even if it has no legal definition attached to it. And that is the tension at the center of this entire situation. Because legally, silence is not guilt. But culturally, silence is often interpreted as avoidance. And avoidance raises questions. Now, Add the legal reality again, because this is where everything becomes grounded. In large federal investigations and multi-party civil cases, prosecutors and attorneys often rely on documentation, witness testimony, and corroborated statements. That means if anyone connected to the situation, directly or indirectly, ever becomes part of a subpoena chain, anything they previously said privately could potentially become relevant. Not as internet rumors, but as sworn testimony. And that is where the stakes change completely. Because once statements enter a legal setting, they are no longer flexible. They are locked into record. And any contradiction between public silence and private statements becomes subject to scrutiny. That is the fear people are talking about online, not just exposure, but consistency. Now, bringing it back to Snoop Dogg, the narrative being circulated suggests that if someone in his position had ever discussed sensitive industry knowledge privately, even informally, it could eventually become relevant if those conversations are ever introduced in legal proceedings through witnesses or third-party testimony. Again, this is speculative discussion, not confirmed fact. But it's the kind of speculation that thrives in high-profile legal environments because the public knows one thing. Eventually, sealed information does not always stay sealed. And when it opens, it rarely opens quietly. Now, what makes this even more complicated is Snoop's public identity. He is not just an artist who can fade into background noise. He is a global brand, a commercial figure, a recurring presence in mainstream media, sports events, endorsements, and family-friendly entertainment. That means every controversy attached to his name carries more weight than a typical celebrity rumor. Because brands are built on consistency, and consistency is fragile when narratives shift. So even unverified discussions become part of brand risk conversations behind the scenes, in marketing, media, and public relations spaces. And that is something most audiences never see. While the internet debates theories, entire professional teams are evaluating perception, timing, and exposure risk. Now zoom out, because this is no longer just about Snoop Dogg or Diddy. This is about how modern fame interacts with digital memory, legal systems, and non-stop content cycles. Nothing disappears anymore. Old clips resurface instantly. Private conversations get leaked. Context gets stripped. And narratives evolve in real time, without needing confirmation. So the real story here is not the allegation itself. It is the environment that allows allegations, confirmed or unconfirmed, to dominate global conversation instantly. And in that environment, even silence becomes part of the narrative. Now, as this situation continues developing, the biggest unknown isn't what the public believes today. It's what future legal proceedings, witness statements, or documentary releases might add to the record. Because once new information enters that system, everything previously discussed online gets reevaluated in hindsight. And that's when narratives either collapse or harden into something far more permanent. So, where does that leave Snoop Dogg in all of this? Right now, in the same place as many public figures connected to large industry ecosystems. Inside the story, but not officially defined by it. Present in conversation, but absent from confirmed legal positioning. And surrounded by speculation that grows louder as real-world investigations continue. Which brings everything down to one final, unavoidable reality. In today's media landscape, you are not only defined by what you say, you are also defined by what others claim you knew. And until the legal system speaks clearly, the internet will continue filling that silence with its own version of the story.